Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of the Josh Lowry podcast here on Landis Communications. A lot of you have gotten to know me over the last couple of years from social media, me walking and talking into my phone, and a lot of everything I said, it was focused on what was going to happen directly to you, the voter, how this is going to impact your life, how this is going to impact the life of your kids, your neighbors, everyone. So what I want to do is basically the same thing I was doing with my videos, but give ourselves a little bit more time to talk about whatever the issue is and how it's affecting you and how it's affecting the voters and how it's affecting your family, your friends, your kids, everyone. Now, the first topic, we're going to talk about tariffs. This may be a national issue, but the fact is it's going to affect every single one of us. So later in the episode, I had on the economist Michael Hicks. He's probably the foremost economist when it comes to the effects on Indiana, right? He's a professor at Ball State. He studies this stuff inside and out. What Michael Hicks is an economist that follows the research and the facts, and it's pretty clear where these tariffs are going. And in fact, he talks about in this interview, you're going to hear about how the Smoot-Hawley tariffs back in like 1929, 1930, and they passed these tariffs, and a bunch of economists signed a letter saying, hey, this is going to make shit way worse. Of course, Congress still goes ahead and does it. And as you have heard, the Great Depression was not the best economic time for America. So fast forward about 100 years later, you got a bunch of economists telling Trump, hey, don't do this. Don't do these tariffs. And you know what Trump's doing anyways? Going straight for it. So in the interview, we talk very in depth about tariffs, and I can't wait for you guys to hear that interview. There's a lot of stuff I didn't know. Before we get into that interview, I want to talk about a couple takeaways I have, but also some stuff I want to say about the tariffs and how it's going to affect us. All right, so the first thing, and we go pretty in depth into this in the interview, but it cannot be overstated. The tariffs are just a tax on Americans, right? That's all it is. A company ships a product to America. The product or those pieces that go into the products, when that piece gets to America, it just sits in the port until someone pays the federal government the tariff, whatever that rate is, whether it's 10%, 30%, 130%. It just sits there. So now the company, the American company, has to pay that tariff to the federal government. Then they get the product. So one of the things Dr. Hicks talks about in the interview is that there was research, there were some tariffs that were enacted in 2018 by Trump. The majority of that tariff that the company pays to get the product out of the port does get passed on to the consumer. Now, Dr. Hicks, of course, explained this in a very scientific and mannerly way. But when I hear that, I think just like, duh, what did anybody think was going to happen? Have we ever seen a company that says, yeah, I'll eat the cost and have a little bit less of a profit so the customer doesn't pay as much? We know for a fact that this is not what ever happens. For a lot of you, the first time you may have ever heard me talk was when I talked about greedflation. So greedflation was the idea that inflation happened after 2021 supply chain issues, right? Inflation happens, things cost more to make. Companies charge the customer more for the same product. But what they did was either the underlying price goes down of the underlying product, and then the company just kept the prices high and made more of a profit. Or, the product went up, let's say 50%, and the company said, no, we're going to charge them 75% more because we know they're going to blame it on inflation. That was greedflation, right? Some of the studies show over half of the cost of what we were paying every time we went to the store was not because of inflation, but because of just excess profits that these corporations were making. Since the beginning of time, if a corporation has a chance to make a higher profit, it will. So why anyone in their right mind thinks that a corporation is going to eat this tariff and not pass it on to the consumer? I got a bridge I want to sell you. But the other thing that Dr. Hicks really pointed out, and this to me actually was like the mind blowing thing, right? Is this a tariff is worse than inflation, right? Because inflation is just the idea that like prices are going up. But as that's happening, incomes are going up, wages are going up. Now, for the average consumer, what it feels like is that prices at the store are going up, but your wages aren't going up as fast. And that really sucks. But what's going to happen with the tariffs, the price of the products are going up. Your wages aren't going up. You think that you're going to walk into work tomorrow and your boss is going to go, hey, I saw there are going to be tariffs, so we're getting everybody a 10% raise. No. So you, me, every single person we go to the store, we're going to be paying 10% more, 20% more, 30% more, whatever that tariff is. Our wages aren't going up to make up for that. This is just pulling money out. So don't get me wrong, inflation in the last 5 years sucked. But there were times for some of us, not all of us, where our wages were rising as much as the cost at the store. That's not what's going to happen with the tariffs. We're just going to feel more pain at the store, but we're not going to get any backup, get any extra in our paycheck to cover for it. We're not going to get any extra in our paycheck to cover for it. Another thing that we talk about, the effect of what's already happened. Because I think for a lot of us, we heard the doomsday, hey, these tariffs are going to be terrible. And then we watched the stock market go back up. We haven't seen anything happen. Dr. Hicks really explains in this interview how, there's a supply chain. It takes a while for this stuff to come into effect. And he explains that even if there is only a 10% tariff, that would cause at least a mild recession this year. Now, at the time that I'm recording this, Trump has pulled the tariffs on China back to, I believe, 30%. There's still a 10% tariff on a lot of other things, on almost every country, basically, actually. So just because we say something's going to be bad, but then it's not as bad as we think, doesn't mean that it's not bad. Even if Trump rolls them back, there's still tariffs. 10% on most countries, 30% on China. That alone will cause a recession. And the thing that sucks so much about these recessions, who is it that gets hurt? Usually the people that just got out of high school or college, or they're young in their careers, or, they have a job that depends on other people spending money. And in this case, they're getting screwed and losing their job because Donald Trump decided. So I know a lot of us are thinking, okay, wait. Why is he even doing these tariffs? And Dr. Hicks and I talk about this quite a bit in an interview. And here's the thing. There's no good reason, but that's not really the focus of this podcast. What I want to talk about is what's going to happen to us, to you, to me, to the average voter. And the truth is, any benefit that could come from the tariffs, it's not going to offset any of the pain. Are there going to be some jobs that maybe come back over here 5 to 10 years down the road? Sure. But in the meantime, we've gone through a recession. A lot more of us will have lost our job before then. In the meantime, a lot more of us are going to have to pay extra costs at the store. And frankly, I've watched over the last couple years in which the entire Trump has been everything can be perfect. I will give you everything you want. You don't have to suffer. And I've watched a lot of voters, look, they show no empathy. I've listened to I'd recommend to any of you guys, listen to the Focus Group podcast hosted by Sarah Longwell, where she actually does focus groups with voters. And a lot of them are aware of the terrible things that Trump is doing on like the issues of due process, on the issue of Medicaid, on the issue of basically anything. And they say, I don't like that, but I'm okay if it lowers my costs. I have to tell you, as an American, as a Hoosier, as a foster parent, especially, That hurts my heart. To know that so many people know that other people will go through pain and they say, that's okay if I get what I want. That's just not the way I was raised. And I wanted to believe that we are better than that. And I think a lot of people are, but unfortunately, just enough people are willing to sacrifice someone else's constitutional rights, willing to sacrifice someone else's job, willing to sacrifice someone else's livelihood so that they can have a better financial situation. And the biggest horse shit of it all is that was all a lie. Prices have not gone down because these tariffs, we're about to go through a recession. A lot of people sold out their fellow Americans to get a personal financial benefit that they're not even going to get anymore and probably never were going to get. Okay, so that's going to be a whole nother podcast because honestly, the lack of empathy has been just shocking to me. So part of that though, when I talk about that lack of empathy, and for those watching the podcast, my dog Ollie will genuinely occasionally make stops. See, there he is. He likes to hop on in. When we're talking about empathy, right? Some of these people voted a certain way because they thought there was going to be a benefit that they were lied to. Another constant thing you are going to hear me talk about on this show and in general is politicians lying to voters. And this is not a Trump specific thing. I want to make something very clear. This has been the effect of 50 years plus, really, but 50 years of politicians selling a bill of goods that they can't deliver on so they can get elected. It started with trickle down economics, this whole idea that I can cut your taxes but provide you more benefits, more services. And ever since then, politicians have played along with it. They tell everyone, you can have the service you want, I'll cut somebody else's service, knowing that they can't do that because then that person would not vote and they would lose their spot. Or they say, you can have that service that you want and I'll cut your taxes. It'll pay for itself, knowing that that math doesn't add up. But we've seen this carry on. And if we're being honest, we've seen Democrats do this. They talk about we're going to cut middle class taxes. They don't talk about how that pays for benefits. Look, here in Indiana, we just had this whole thing. They just talked about cutting property taxes. And nobody was honest with the voters about what was going to be taken away from them. The property taxes is how we fund our local governments in Indiana. There are going to be a lot of services that have to be cut, and it's going to suck. But the fact is, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And frankly, I'm tired of politicians lying to people about this. Look, you're going to hear me say a lot of things about what I think should happen in politics or what needs to be done. But to me, there's two overwhelming things that need to be done. One is we have to start talking about empathy again. We have to start talking about what's actually going to happen to other people. We have to start telling people it's okay to have empathy. It's not a weakness. It's a strength. It's what separates us from other animals. Empathy is not a human weakness. It's what makes us great. It's the only reason that we've been able to create societies where we do care for the needy. Fact is, when someone like me thinks, hey, it's okay if I pay a little more in taxes, if it means that school kids don't have to go hungry, if it means that the sick have access to medical care that they need, if it means that someone that doesn't have the same advantages as I might have had has access to an education that allows them to get a better job and further their life. And so many people felt like they couldn't say that because then someone would pop out and say, oh, look at the socialist, look at the communist. He doesn't know what it's like to earn a paycheck. Motherfucker, the only reason you were able to go earn that paycheck in the first place was because you had schools, because you had roads, because you had police. Everybody talks about being the self-made millionaire, self-made, oh, look what I did from scratch. You worked hard. I'm not going to deny that. But let me ask you something. As you drove to that business where you created your wealth, did you drive on a road that the government made? Did somebody come and steal your property? Or did the police enforce property rights? Did you teach all your employees from the bottom up, or did they go to public schools and then you hired them after they graduated? Oh, and let's not forget, did you use the fucking internet? You know, the thing that without government funding would have never developed? Okay. All right. Had to get that out. I'm sorry. I have nothing against someone becoming successful. Good on you. Congratulations. I tip my hat to you. What I have a problem with is people becoming successful and not paying it back, not being willing to pay their fair share of taxes so someone else has a chance to succeed just like they did. And the fact is, for most of us, taxes is the best thing that we can get a return of investment on. You spend $1 on a kid's education, the chances of them not going to jail, the chances of them growing up and being a productive member of society, the chances of them being a good family member skyrocket. Putting money into our education, into our mental health services, everything for children. You couldn't get a better return on investment. I'm a foster parent. I could tell you when kids don't get support they need from the beginning, it's a long road from there on. Society is going to pay that price at one point or another. So I humbly suggest we help children and people when they need help instead of waiting until the problem's already happened. Well, for everyone listening, you've now just heard one of my random Josh Lowry rants. No, it was not really related to tariffs, but we got there. So let me circle back to the tariffs real quick, because there is one last thing. Dr. Hicks and I talked about this a lot, and this is something that is going to be a big deal going forward. Even if these tariffs brought a lot of jobs back, a lot of those jobs are just going to be replaced by automation. So here's a stat that Dr. Hicks points out that's mind-blowing to me. In 1979, for every 1,000 people that worked in a factory, we can produce that same amount with only 217 people. 217 people. Guys, that means it takes 783 less people to do the same amount of work that it took 1,000 in 1979. He points out that for every one job we probably lost to trade, we lost 7 or 8 to automation. So look, I'm not saying that free trade didn't cause some people to lose their jobs. What I am saying is that we can't allow ourselves to follow a boogeyman or a straw man when that's not actually the underlying problem. And I'm not actually saying automation is a problem, because there's been a lot of benefits to our lives. This will also have to be a whole nother episode. What I am saying is that if we actually want to help workers, the key is not to try to turn the clock back. Guys, you can't ever put the genie back in the bottle. What we need to do is provide people the education and resources they need to move into this new economy. I mean, Dr. Hicks said another thing. When was this? I didn't write it down. Sometime recently, like within the last year, there were over 2 million manufacturing jobs that were open. Look, guys, we're obsessed with nostalgia in America. A lot of this talk about manufacturing jobs, it's just wanting to turn the clock back. I don't know if you guys saw that chart or the stat, but they did a poll, and 75% of Americans said we need more manufacturing jobs, but only 25% said they want to work them. 3/4 of America doesn't want to work in a factory, and yet we're trying to create more than a quarter of our jobs in manufacturing. We're not actually dealing with the problem. We're trying to say, look, things were great in the 1950s. Why don't we go back there? First off, things weren't great in the 1950s for everyone. Let's keep that in mind. Second off, hey, remember when we had all those high-paying middle-class jobs? Unions represented over a third of workers at that point. We cut unions off at the knees. 20% of American workers that were union employees are now not, and they make less. And we're sitting here acting like there's any other reason. Unions made us more money when you're the average worker. It's a fact. You have better health benefits. You make more money. You have better job security, all kinds of things. Right-wing media spent 5 decades attacking unions. It worked. People turned against unions. And those same people got a lot less, good paying jobs. Again, that wasn't tariffs. That wasn't free trade. That wasn't even automation. That was a bunch of rich people that didn't want to pay their employees more. Oh, Lord. Okay, all right. So I swear I'm going to try to keep this podcast on one issue at a time. But the fact is I can't really talk about tariffs without talking about the other effects, because people will use the tariffs to try to say, hey, because of free trade, X happened. So we have to use tariffs to deal with X. That wasn't really what caused X. Automation caused some of these job losses. Getting rid of unions caused some of these job losses. The fact that some people don't want to work in a factory has caused some people to not work in a factory. But that's the exact point of this podcast. I understand in politics, the goal is take everything and boil it down to a bumper sticker. But the fact is, no issue is that simple. So what I'm going to do is try to take one issue at a time and talk about it. We'll have an expert or someone that is dealing with the actual issue. There will be an interview. That's where you guys are going to get a lot of the details. It'll be as long as necessary. But in the podcast, we're also going to have me talking about what I learned and applying that to you and to me. And the focus is going to be kept on you, the voter. I'm going to do my best, try not to go on as many rants. But look, nobody's perfect. That's Tariffs 101. There's whole courses. There are people that are experts about this, and we're about to talk to one of them. But I'm trying to shorten it as much as I can. But let's be clear. These tariffs are going to hurt us. We're not really going to see any benefit to us, the voter. So don't let them sell you on fake stuff. Like, there's going to be times where in the future they're going to say there was a benefit or there was no negative. And I'm going to pull up a clip of this podcast, show you, hey, remember when we said this? And then show you evidence that happened. We're going to go to break, and then we are going to get into the interview with Dr. Hicks. Now, I do want to make a note. I'm new to this podcasting thing. You're going to hear me sound like I have a lisp in my interview with Dr. Hicks. This is nothing against people with lisps. I just don't have one. That's me not knowing how to work a microphone. I talked too close to the microphone. I had a gain thing turned up. I didn't know what I'm doing. I apologize. So everybody, please enjoy the interview, and just every time you hear me talk, imagine that there was somebody else cooler sounding asking that question. But we'll make sure we keep that cleared up in the future. All right, so stay tuned for our interview with Dr. Hicks. And thank you guys for tuning in to the first episode of the Josh Lowry podcast. Joining me is our first guest, Dr. Michael Hicks. He is the director of the Center for Business and Economic Research at Ball State University. And if you're in Indiana, you've probably read him in the Indianapolis Star. Dr. Hicks, first off, thank you for joining us.
Right, it's good to be with you.
I have some questions about tariffs, but first, Dr. Hicks, we need to talk about the most important thing that people are going to want to know, and that is that you are almost the 6th member of the Backstreet Boys. Is that correct?
Real close. Real close.
So what I'm referring to is apparently you testified at the same Senate committee hearing that the Backstreet Boys did. Is that correct?
Yes. You're digging way back to, I think, 2000 or 2001 when I was in West Virginia studying the coal economy and provided some testimony actually to a committee that Hillary Clinton was chair.
Did you actually get to meet the Backstreet Boys?
I didn't. There was a big fan following that I couldn't break through. I was one of the old economists sort of laying out the economic effects of the coal mining restrictions on blocking creeks. Essentially, what would be the fiscal effects of some of these restrictions was the primary part of the estimate. So, and some work that we had done for the West Virginia legislature that was trying to understand, hey, if new coal mining rules come in place, what's going to happen to us? How we're going to have to change. So I was pretty austere, and one of the Backstreet Boys, I can't remember which one it was, is from Eastern Kentucky, so he had a lot of family interest in it, and
Mm.
was testifying in support of the EPA.
Yeah, well, they missed out. They'd probably still be famous if they would have just got you in.
That's right.
So, Dr. Hicks, we're going to talk about tariffs, but I
Right.
think we need to start from the bottom because if we're being honest, a lot of us don't know how tariffs work, and we're quickly trying to become experts so that we sound like we know what we're talking about. So, if you could just start literally from the bottom, like what is a tariff?
Right. A tariff is a tax that is levied on an import into the country, primarily goods, either manufactured goods or agricultural goods. They could also be on services. That's harder to collect, like a streaming movie. It's hard to collect that. And it's just a tax. So it's a tax rate. So when you hear about there's 145% tax rate on China as we speak, that just means that for every dollar that's imported, the importing company has to pay $1.45 in taxes.
So, who are they paying that tax to? Like, who's collecting it?
Oh, it's the U.S. government. I forget the tax form, but the importer actually is the administrative entity that pays the tax. The incidence of that tax could fall on different entities. So the seller might be able to eat a little bit of it. They may be able to squeeze their profits or reduce their costs. The importer might pay part of the taxes by squeezing their profits, reducing prices, cutting somewhere else. But the most recent evidence that we have, I think 4 or 5 really good papers after 2018, show that the vast majority of tariffs are paid by consumers. So ultimately, if it's a product that I buy directly, I'm going to pay almost all that tariff. And if it's funneled through the supply chain, so most of what we import goes onto a part of a car or a washer and dryer or a satellite or something, we're going to pay some sort of that as it gets to us.
So, I want to try to visualize this. If we say we have some item in China, an American company wants to import it. The company pays the company in China, it gets shipped over to America. When it gets to America, the importer has to pay that tax, the tariff, before they can take the product. Is that right?
Correct. Before they can leave a port, whoever is collecting the tariff tax there. And you've seen on social media some of the tariff sheets showing like, yeah, I had to pay it. It has to be paid by the directly paid by the American company, the importer to that tax entity. But again, who bears that could shift a little bit. But again, it's ultimately it's being paid by the American company, and most of that is going to be borne by the American consumer, like 95+% of it.
Right. So the company pays the tariff. Generally, companies don't take less profit, so they're going to charge more for whatever that product is when they turn around and sell it.
Correct. They're just going to pass that on to the consumer, particularly because everybody's facing the same thing. There's not much reason to struggle to take lower profit. You're not going to pick up a lot of market share. Everybody's paying roughly the same tariff on these items. And so it's going to be across the board increase in costs, just depending on what your household's mix of consumption is.
A lot of things when we hear about like, oh, it's made in China, I think sometimes people think about, toys and little things, but a lot of items that are there's going to be a tariff, that's not the individual item that you go and buy in the store. It's a part of something that goes into something else, like with vehicles and stuff like that. Could you kind of just speak, I guess, to are most of the things imported actually part of another supply chain once they get here?
Yes, most everything that we import into the United States is used to make something here. Either we're buying a commodity product, metal, iron ore, rice, and we're turning it into another product, or it's already partially assembled and we're assembling it into another product. So almost everything, and most things that we import that are partially assembled, like maybe a wiring harness from Mexico, probably already has parts from Canada and Peru and Taiwan and China in that. So most of what we import comes from multiple places, and most of things then that we export is the same way, maybe built in dozens of countries. 85, 90% of what we buy here in Indiana, our manufactured goods, goes directly to a company that is manufacturing it and selling it to another American.
Right. Because I heard someone say that like there's no such thing really as an American made car. Maybe you could say like a North American made car, but everything has something from somewhere else in it.
Right. Not only does everything have something from somewhere else, it's crazy to think of a U.S. automobile market or supply chain. It's really North America because it's so integrated that there are parts like a dashboard or a suspension system that are pulling parts together and crossing the Canadian US border 2 times, crossing the Mexican border to the US a couple of times. And the reason for this is transportation costs are so low, and it's really good to have a company that meets all the ISO 9001 standards, all the things that are part of making a really precision automobile, that we in North America generally buy less expensive parts from other countries. We assemble them here, send them mostly to the US and a little bit to Canada to make them into really high value items. So we're the top of the food chain where the real value is added.
Now, for a lot of us, this has been the most exposure we have ever had to tariffs, right? Or even the talk of it. But when Trump would talk about them, he'd always talk about, was it President McKinley? I mean, the tariffs are not new, right? Could you kind of maybe talk to us a little bit about how tariffs have been used previous to this last year?
Right. So tariffs are old. They've been around a long time, somewhere between the 12th and the 16th century, 17th century. This idea of mercantilism came up that the economy is like a business. If you sell more than you buy, then you're winning. And Adam Smith came along in 1776 and said that doesn't work. In fact, that was King George II, King George III's favorite economic policy. And Adam Smith came along and said, no, what makes an economy grow isn't economy isn't a business. It's more like a small village where the division of labor causes productivity growth. And so trading improves your specialization, makes you more productive. And he didn't use it in his book, but the example is the globe is in the past, 80 years in the U.S., the standard of living has risen about fourfold, and globally, it's risen about 5 or 6 times, just because really poor countries are growing quickly. Who are we trading with? We're not trading with Mars or Venus. It's really productivity growth due to specialization of labor and more capital. And so early tariffs were used by the British it was a very obvious example to try to make a few companies really rich, and they kept other, most of the economies that were dealing with them poor. Think India, their own domestic manufacturing workers and Americans. But tariffs remained popular because that was the only way we could get enough revenue to pay for a Navy and an Army. By the Civil War, we tried to get rid of tariffs. McKinley brought a few in, caused a fairly sharp recession. And then we had a very long period of trade that ended in World War I. And in 1929, 1930, we got the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which probably contributed, the estimates vary, but maybe half of the depth and duration of the Great Depression. And so the tariffs went from 4 or 5% average tax to 26, 25, 26% average tax, kept us in a recession from really, we started in 1929, the tariffs hit in 1930. By 1933, the unemployment rate was 24%, and we didn't really get out of the recessionary, the slow growth until the start of World War II, 1941. And so tariffs really contribute that, some directly in higher commodity costs, some to bank failures. And the world recognized that. So from near the end of World War II, when it was obvious the Allies were going to win and we started doing post-war economic negotiations, we decided that eliminating tariffs was a big goal. And the U.S., the developing countries have been just cutting tariffs since the end of World War II. And they were really, when President Trump took office, they were about 0.8%. So there were a few industries that could lobby really hard everywhere to get tariffs, and they won politically. And then all the rest of trade was free. And in 2018, he raised tariffs on China, primarily a little bit on Mexico and Canada, which he later rescinded. And that ended up being disastrous. Americans paid $300 or $400 billion extra in taxes. We became net importers of food for the first time because China stopped buying soybeans. So we were in a manufacturing recession here in the Midwest. You hear Pete Buttigieg talk about that all the time. And we spent, I think, $40 billion bailing out farmers who were clobbered by this trade war. So, tariffs. And the only reason Trump could assess tariffs is that in the midst of the Cold War, right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Congress gave the president unilateral authority to raise tariffs in an emergency declaration. There's a follow-on emergency declaration law. Article 232 of the Trade Act is really the prime piece of legislation. And when he did that, that was rarely used. It was used a couple, 3 times to sort of send a warning shot to somebody we thought was not abiding by our international policy goals, not so much economic goals. And then Trump came in and makes all these claims of national security, which are, marginally constitutional if they are constitutional. And that's what's given us this tariff. So as we entered this year, unfortunately, President Biden kept them. There's a share of the American left that has been very pro-tariff. And the point is tariffs are often promoted by some unions because they do favor a few industries. But in general, they tend to be a fairly unproductive tax in terms of capacity to raise revenue and the damage they do to our productivity.
My dog wanted to be a guest, apparently.
I get that. Anyway, that's the long and short of tariffs are on a bipartisan basis and an international basis. We've been trying to squeeze them out for a long time. And I actually think that the tariff calls from the left, like Bernie Sanders, and we heard, Gretchen Whitman, we heard Jason Crow, Representative, I think, DeLulio from Western Pennsylvania in the last few weeks say tariffs are good. I think mostly they're using it to move the Overton window, towards industrial policy that will help places that have lost jobs, over the past 50 years. When you look at tariffs and you look at trade, a lot of Americans think, gosh, we lost all those factories to China. And we really didn't. There's very little manufacturing production that's moved overseas. Mostly what's happened is automation has clobbered those jobs. And so now that's kind of where we're at today.
There's actually a couple of things you hit on that I kind of want to pull apart. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs. What was the justification for those back in 1929? The Great Depression, I think, is about to start, if it hasn't already. So, but what was the justification for why they're doing those large tariffs then?
Very much what we're seeing now. So the stock market began a long slide in October of 1929. It actually took many, many months. So it wasn't a one-day slide like we think. It took many months for the stock market to lose over half its value. Smoot and Hawley were 2 senators from ag-producing states, I think Tennessee and Oregon, and they thought that tariffs would prevent imports from overseas and boost their domestic economy, mostly in ag, but also in manufacturing. And when the tariffs went into place, there's actually a famous graphic that shows we had small tariffs, other countries retaliated, we retaliated again. And so the tax rates continued to get bigger and bigger and bigger over time until they really crushed all of our exports. So it was very difficult to export commodity goods, primarily ag goods, and very expensive to buy things that we needed to produce the cars and things like that we were at the time trying to sell. And at the same time, the commodity crash hit farmland in the United States, farmers, at a time when banks were not really protected. They were very vulnerable. And so that led to a pretty big closure of banks in the U.S. With that run on banks in 1930, 31, 32 has really deepened the Great Recession. So It was the same sort of idea that we're going to bring jobs back, but it didn't. The evidence was clear that it didn't. It just extended the Great Depression for a decade, maybe.
Now we have, economists like you and a lot of other economists saying, hey, this isn't going to end well. When the Smoot-Hawley tariffs went into place, was that the first test case, or was there a 1929 Michael Hicks with the 10-piece suits that they had on screaming, hey guys, this is going to go bad, and they just didn't listen?
Ironically, at the time, 1,000 economists, which was a substantial share of all the economists in the country, signed an open letter in the Wall Street Journal to President Hoover, saying, look, you don't want to do this. And I was actually one of the signatories, almost 2,000 signatories last month of economists who signed a very similar letter making the same claims. And in the 1920s, the 1930 economists ranged the full political spectrum to people who are Democratic supporters, had been in previous administrations, to libertarian, very free trade economists who were supporting the Republicans. The economists on this list today, again, ranged the full gamut of those of us who've been in libertarian circles, who've advised, Republican governors and administrations, all the way to the, those who've been in the White House for the Obama administration, the Clinton administration, and the Biden administration. So there's really only one economist that I know today who's actively promoting tariffs as an economic policy, and he works for Donald Trump.
Convenient. Let me get this straight. Before the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that were horrible for the economy, a group of economists signed a letter to the Wall Street Journal saying, don't do it. They did it, and it destroyed the economy.
Yes.
Fast forward 100 years, Trump wants to do these, and a group of economists sign a letter to the Wall Street Journal saying, don't do it, and they're still doing it.
Yes, and so I hope this event will buy us another century before we devolve into stupid once again.
So hopefully it's the only time I have to deal with this. You have to, as a millennial, this is the 400th once in a lifetime event that I've dealt with. So hopefully we keep it that way. Real quick about so Trump did tariffs, you mentioned, in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And it hurt a lot of people, especially here in the Midwest. Was that something that economists were talking about then? Because I could tell you that's, having been involved in politics, that didn't break through anywhere. People think that Trump has a magic wand when it comes to the economy.
Right. No, it was what happened was it was there was a big debate in 2015, 2016 about trade. I was part of that debate. It was in the this issue came up in the early parts of the debate, the 2020 campaign. I mean, Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren argued about, and Andrew Yang argued about this on stage. But the Trump tariffs were put in place. They were much more modest than they are now. They were put in place in March of 2019 or 2018, which was the end of at that point, we'd had about 7 years of continual manufacturing job growth. It was at that point, the longest factory job growth period of expansion in probably since the 1920s, if maybe ever. Going back as far as we had data. And he put the tariffs in. The job growth stopped within 6 months. It completely reversed. So by 2019, we had lost 10,000 jobs here in Indiana. Nationally, we had lost a bigger number of factory jobs. But again, the effect really hit the industrialized Midwest first because of what we make, because we're making this huge globalized supply chain of transportation equipment. And then I thought by January of 2020, there was a reasonably good chance that the U.S. would be in recession that summer because those tariffs were really eating into our job growth. I mean, you can see it in the 2019 forecasts. And then something came along and smacked us in February and March of 2020, and we completely lost that. So before tariffs really bit us hard, we had COVID that interrupted it. So for the average American who's not looking at the daily statistics, who isn't tracking job losses in factories, it wasn't a big deal. I think if we had not had COVID, it would have been a very big deal in the 2020 election.
Wow. I did not realize that we probably were headed towards a recession in 2020. I guess what's interesting to me is the way that you describe it. It's like in 2018, the Trump administration put one finger on a hot burner and got burnt. And in response to not touching the burner again, this time they're like, I'm going to put my entire hand on it. And maybe this time it won't burn me.
No, and let me just say for your listeners who may say, I've always heard trade is bad, and I've always heard that tariffs are good. There's no doubt that I live in Muncie, Indiana, a Rust Belt town. It wasn't trade that hurt us. The jobs that we had in manufacturing for auto parts are still in the U.S. 200 for every 1,000 people working in a factory in 1970, we can produce the same value of goods today with 217 folks. And just so people know, the peak factory production, when you adjust for inflation in Indiana, was fourth quarter 2024. So we would have peaked in 2025 if it hadn't been for tariffs. We would have peaked in 2026. We'll peak again at some future date, I expect. Peak employment was 1973. And
Mhm.
so when people say, "Oh, we lost all these jobs," we didn't. We lost some jobs overseas, but for every job we lost overseas to manufacturing, we lost 7 or 8 to productivity. And some of those may have been expedited by risks from Chinese trade, but it really wasn't foreigners that did this to us. If anything, most of the jobs that relocated out of here relocated to South Carolina and Tennessee and Kentucky, but the real story was productivity growth. And so I'm sympathetic to the argument that there's some concern here. I'm also sympathetic, but it's not going to be fixed by tariff. And economists have long said place-based or person-based economic development policies will help. Better education. Most places that got walloped, that had above average educational attainment, continue to grow just fine. We actually created, for every job lost in factories in Indiana after NAFTA, we gained 6 or 7 non-factory jobs. For every job we've lost in factories after the China shock of 2001, we've gained 4 non-factory jobs. So we've done fine. It's the people who can't transition who've really struggled. The other argument is a national security argument that I'm sympathetic to as well, that maybe what we need to bring back some chip manufacturing from China. Just to point out, though, the good Chinese are the ones making semiconductors, not the communist Chinese. So we hear China's making semiconductors, it's the allies of ours where we have military bases. And so we're trying to get those chip manufacturers here through the CHIPS Act. The way you do that is through industrial policy domestically for national security. Let the Chinese make the semiconductor that goes in your toaster. We'll make the one that goes into a spy satellite. So, I'm fine for boycotting or tariffing countries to make them be less bellicose, more secure. The fact of the matter is, we like to think peace is the opposite of war. It's not. Trade is the opposite of war. Peace is neutral. We just don't fight anybody. We don't interact with them. If you're trading with somebody, you're actually building a relationship. You're trying to anticipate their needs. They're trying to anticipate yours. It's a very collaborative activity, not the antagonistic activity that Donald Trump seems to believe it is, against all evidence of the past quarter millennium of economic writing.
The justification you just gave for why there might be national security reason to do that, that would be very specific to those things that we're trying to keep secure, right? Like if we're talking about chips, we wouldn't need to put a tariff on the baby dolls that are coming out of China.
Right, or avocados from Mexico. The other point that really actually extinguishes this idea, the stupidity of the idea that Trump offers is, if you're going to do a trade war against China, what you do is you find a group of other countries that share your concern. And they would be places like Taiwan and Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and Australia, Burma, Vietnam. These are countries, India, Bangladesh, who are very nervous about China and their potential territorial interests. And you would create a block of those countries who would trade freely together, strengthening their economies. And then we would exclude China and make them, abide by human rights laws and stop their pilfering fisheries, things like that. And we were actually, the Obama administration was actually doing that with the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so what we've done instead of isolating China, we put a 47% tariff on Vietnam. We put a 25% tariff on Taiwan. We put a 10% tariff on Japan. We put a 25% tariff on Mexico. We put a 25% tariff on Canada, 15% on Australia. So we just clobbered these countries who are our allies, very close allies, in planning to defeat Chinese aggression if it were to occur. So that national security argument I'm sympathetic to, but that can't be what Donald Trump is doing. I don't know what he's doing. His arguments are contradictory. They can't be national security, can't be a bargaining chip that's going to reduce trade barriers and also permanent trade barriers that onshore manufacturing. It's ridiculous.
One of the things that I've already seen, it looks like China is aware of this and they're going to pull in some of the people that should have been us pulling them in as the Chinese adversaries. Like the idea of reaching out to, like, China understands if we make people dependent on us, then they're dependent on us.
Right.
That's a national security benefit, as where we're doing the exact opposite.
Correct. So trade, again, is a mutually beneficial exchange. And so when you trade with another country, this is a longstanding research in political science and international affairs, that it reduces your probability of war. And so trade builds relationships, it builds dependencies. Going to war is going to damage your economy. You tend to share values when you do this. And so it tends to, China's become more open, more democratic as a consequence of trade, not less democratic. They're still communists, they're still a dictatorship, but they're less at damage and less at risk to us the more we trade. And so if other countries are dependent on China, and China is highly dependent on other countries as well, that reduces overall risk of war. So what China has now, what we've done is we've said we're going to go to trade war against 193 countries. We're at 188 because we didn't put tariffs on Russia or Belarus or Georgia, which are satellite, or Iran, satellite countries of Russia. And we're going to put tariffs on everybody else, including these allies who we've been to war with, right? Ukraine, Poland, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. We actually have American military officers in their headquarters serving in their units, and they have them in our units as well. We're integrated. And so we've said we're going to have a trade war with 180 some countries. All the rest of those countries, they have a trade war with one country. That's us. And so we've absolutely eviscerated our capacity to say, oh, I'd like to go someplace else to buy something. And I think that the lasting damage of this, we haven't really talked about all the damage that's going to occur from this, but the lasting damage is that the markets that we've been really productive and good at in things like pork production or soybean production, that's going away. China has now invested a ton of money in opening soybean and pork processing facilities in South America, in Brazil and Argentina. And so we're going to lose our soybean exporting capacity. But countries around the world know that that's a hotbed of support for Donald Trump on American farms. And so they're just going to stop buying it. I think we've just had 2 announcements in the last 3 weeks, 0 exports to China of soybeans, and they've cut a 12 million ton shipments of pork that were scheduled over this year. Kills the 2 biggest exporters out of Indiana commodities, where the 3 biggest are going to be pork, soybean, and corn. And we've just ended those 2 big ones. So we're in a farm recession this summer. It may never come back. There may be nothing we can do to reinvigorate those export markets. And again, your balance of trade isn't really a big indicator of how successful you are or how great it is, but why we would interfere with markets that were favoring American farmers and now we're shifting that commodity somewhere else just strikes me as politically unsavvy and ultimately counterproductive to the best interests of Americans, whether or not they are or not farmers.
I know he's given a million different justifications, right? But like, I think underlying all of Trump's justifications is he believes if you're in a trade deficit, you're losing. If you're in a trade surplus, you're winning. And that, I mean, I'm in a trade deficit with the Mexican restaurant across the street, right? Could you just kind of quickly explain for the viewers, the listeners, like what actually is a trade surplus or deficit, and why is that not necessarily a bad or good thing?
You're right. It's a great question. And I love the example of, I'm a example that I think a very liberal economist, John Kenneth Galbraith, gave was I'm in a trade deficit with my barber. I go to him every 6 weeks and he buys nothing from me. So a trade deficit is just simply that you sell less abroad than you buy from abroad. And so there's no reason why you would have a balanced trade with any one country. Like we buy a lot of bananas from Haiti and Dominican Republic. And so most American households probably have bananas in them right now. And they're a poor country. They don't buy a lot of stuff from us. They're not buying a Lexus or big agricultural equipment. They're not buying satellite times or things like that. So we probably run a big trade deficit with Haiti. We actually sell more stuff to Great Britain than we buy from them. They're a rich country. We are a huge country. And so we have a lot of things they want to buy. They're a small country. They're a little bit bigger than California. So they sell us some things that we like, and they buy a lot of stuff that we like. So we're running a trade surplus with Great Britain. And so overall, we run a modest trade deficit, which means we're buying more things than we sell. And the primary reason for that, and it gets kind of technical, is people around the world hold American dollars for exchange. We've been the exchange currency since the since the end of World War II, really, 1944, 45. If you wanted to buy something, you had to have dollars. So anywhere you go in the world, you can go into a bodega in Iraq in the middle of a war in 1991, like I did, and buy sodas on a battlefield from the bodega owner in US dollars. Or if you want to sell oil anywhere, you need to have dollars. So the rest of the world has to hold some of our currency, and then they denominate what they do in that currency. We're the world's reserve currency. And so because of the reason we do that is because we have been, up until the last 100 days, the stablest, most assured, most respected, most powerful economy in the world. It's actually, people call it the exorbitant privilege that we have. That lets us consume more than we produce. And so that's why we have a trade surplus, is that because the rest of the world says, America, you're so great. I'm going to invest in your factories and farms. I'm going to put my money in your stock market. I'm going to hold some of your bonds because I know that's safe. And I need your money to transact because I know that that money has value. It actually is like paying tribute to the United States. It allows us to consume more than we produce. And so that privilege is why we run a trade surplus. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not at immediate risk of going away simply because we're so dominant. There's no number two. There's no Bitcoin. Europe's an idea. China's a prison. Bitcoin's a wish. And so we're going to hold that for a while, but that's really fueling this extra consumption. And it's not costing us factory jobs. If we lose that, if anything, our exports are going to drop, our affluence is going to drop, we're going to be buying fewer things. So the whole mystery around this issue is just bizarre. And the other thing I'll add is we are net exporters of services, which are really high value added. Things like movies and education and financial services and professional services and all that sort of stuff. We're big exporters on. That's really high value added. So each person's producing a ton of value there. That's where we could really be targeted for risk if people could effectively tax it. It's hard to tax a Netflix movie made in the US. If it were easy, countries around the world would be doing it right now just to raise revenue because we dominate those domains.
So part of the problem here is that tariffs and trade can be rather complex issues, and yet Donald Trump has turned them into a one-sentence bumper sticker. Trade bad.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Don't buy those dolls for your girls. She doesn't need 30, she only needs 2. I mean, that ought to be a bumper sticker because it's so reminiscent of the austerity programs in the Soviet Union in the 1950s that it makes me want to vomit.
Actually, with all this about the only buy 2 dolls instead of 30, however he phrased it, I think that's what we should talk about because a lot of the talk about tariffs plays into big picture stuff that we've talked about, right? But this is going to affect the individual consumer if they go to buy a doll for Christmas. So can we just walk through some of the actual effects that these massive tariffs will have on people? What's going to happen when we go to the store?
Right. So just the consumer side first on imports that you buy directly. So you go to Target and get clothes, you can go to Walmart and get clothes, you can go to Amazon and buy a shirt. A big proportion of those are imported. We don't make cheap stuff in the U.S. Our manufacturing industry is extraordinarily robust. So we buy our inexpensive items from overseas, and the price of those are all going to go up from 10% to 145%, whatever the tariffs are. And some of those will just be unavailable at a 50% tariff rate. A lot of consumers just aren't going to buy stuff. They're not going to see their prices double. And so just on the consumption side directly, the Yale Budget Lab says that about the average family in America, which is earning about $80,000 a year, is going to see an immediate impact in 2026 of about $4,600 in higher costs. So your real earnings are going to drop. And just to that sounds like inflation because the prices are going up. Inflation occurs when the value of your currency drops relative to itself in the past. So there's more of it going around. So it affects both prices for things like eggs and clothing, and it affects wages. So we're going to look at this, and we're going to look at inflation, and we're going to be whimsically nostalgic for inflation because we're only getting the price increases now, none of the wage benefits.
So with inflation, we're talking wages are rising, but costs are usually rising more. That's when people think of inflation. With the tariffs, we're just saying, nope, your wages aren't rising, just your costs.
Right. And sometimes during the last bout of inflation, wages rose faster than the price of goods over time, but the early stages inflation was worse than wages caught up. But we don't think about our wages very much. A lot of us think, well, I'm getting paid more. I must deserve it because I'm a better employee. But that egg tastes exactly the same as it did a year ago, so it shouldn't be more expensive. So there's that normal human money illusion, we call it in economics. It's fairly normal. But what we're seeing now, the term that we've used for it, the profession used for it in the 70s was stagflation. So higher costs, but no growth in wages, no growth in employment. So we're going to see much higher prices, like 5 to 8% on average, just from the tariffs. That's the consumption side. On the production side, because we all make stuff, we all have jobs, or we're earning income, and we all consume. So the consumption side's a recessionary shock. On the production side, a lot of this affects a lot of that $4,600 comes in the form of higher car costs. So getting a battery from China or component parts from China or Mexico or Canada are more expensive. And so businesses now are looking at this. American manufacturing primarily is looking at this and saying, I've got to raise prices. We've already seen Ford say all my EV cars are now going to be $2,000 more. I think the estimate of the early tariffs was like $1,500 per car. It's more like $3,500. So part of that 4,600 average assumes that some families will have to buy a new car next year, but most families are going to delay that consumption. So what's going to happen is we're going to start seeing families delay consumption. So auto sales are going to go down. They're going to wait to hope that the tariffs go away. People are going to move away from buying an RV, and maybe they'll just take a vacation this year because Europeans aren't coming as much. So a Disney vacation is going to be cheaper this summer than it was last summer because they're going to be in recession because people aren't visiting as well. We haven't talked about the boycott effects that are occurring. And so on the consumption side, we're going to be able to consume less. On the production side, firms are going to respond with higher prices because they have no choice but producing less. So we're going to start seeing layoffs in manufacturing by end of May or early June. We've already seen the beginning of huge contraction in shipments. So just to put this in context, we ship back and forth to China about 16 million TEUs, which is essentially a tractor trailer worth of stuff. And so if that goes away, most of that's going to go away. 12, 14, 15 million of that's just going to stop. The Port of Washington State, which usually handles hundreds of containers an hour, has no ships in port right now as of yesterday. The port of Long Beach, which is the busiest port in the world, is down 40. By the end of next week and the week thereafter, we're going to have layoffs for Teamsters, for dock workers, for people who are moving commerce from onto rails and onto. We're going to see trains being idled along the sidings here in Indiana. It's going to be very reminiscent of the summer of 2008 when we didn't make any cars. We stopped producing stuff. And the reason for this is I'm an auto producer. I need to buy a piece from China. I'm not going to pay 145% of that because I think the president's going to dump that tariff down to 50% or 0% in a week or two. I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to build a new factory here, of course. That takes 5 years. These tariffs aren't going to be in 5 years. There's going to be a new president in 5 years and 3 new Congresses. So nobody's going to make any business investment. So we're in for a very sharp downturn it's already started. It's already in the economic data. You'll start seeing it at Target and Walmart and your grocery store. You'll start seeing your uncle or your cousin who's a truck driver is going to idle his rig. You're going to see trains sitting in the sidings. It's going to get quieter at night here in the Midwest as trains stop moving through. And again, factories are going to cut a shift. I've already know a couple of factories, one in Madison, Indiana. It's a big import exporter. They've cut a shift. They'll cut another shift in 2 or 3 weeks. And so that's right on the horizon. And that's baked in right now. If Donald Trump changes his mind, we're still weeks away from that production being ramped back up and coming into here. So we're in a recession now that will persist well into summer, even if he ends the tariffs tomorrow.
So I think that's something that is making some people question this, right? Is, hey, we heard that terrible things are going to happen, but it's now been, over a month since Liberation Day, and everything's still fine.
Normally, a recession comes at us fairly slowly. We start seeing indicators of it months in advance. We look at the economic data and we say, all right, we're seeing a persistent slowdown in job growth. We're seeing declines in investment. We're seeing reduction in consumer sentiment. This came to us all at once. So consumer sentiment's now deeply in recession territory. Business investments in recession territory. Business or manufacturing production is already in recession territory. Help wanted ad declines are deeply into recession territory. Here in Indiana, help wanted ads are down 42% since January 20th when we started this. So what that means is businesses have said, I'm just not going to hire anymore. I'm going to wait and see what happens. And so a couple of things made it look better than it is. So generally, our businesses in Indiana import about $8 billion worth of goods each year. We have a nearly $600 billion economy. So we're importing those and we're making them into other items. January and February of this year, there was a skyrocket in imports. We bought a ton of stuff in January, $16 billion in each of those 2 months. We don't yet have the March numbers, but overall imports in the U.S. were down 5%. That means that in March, there was a collapse of tariffs down to way down. And so we're still, the tail end of that's still playing out. Households bought cars at record numbers in January and February. I got a 2008 Honda Pilot. I need to get a new one. We should have done something there. So households bought automobiles. The price of used automobiles spiked. People bought a lot of clothes, a lot of things they knew were going to be imported. We saw big spikes in consumption of household durables. And to beat the tariffs, all that's now over. All the tariff, nothing else that's arriving into shores now. Everything is tariff. So orders are down. Small businesses are leaving orders on the shore. In fact, the biggest inventory problem we have right now is a lot of small businesses will buy $100,000 of shoes or $100,000 of wine. So if you buy $100,000 of shoes from China and you're going to sell that for $200,000-$300,000, you're going to really mark that up because that's what happens when you sell those things in an American store. But now there's $145,000 tariff on top of that. So if you take order of that for $100,000, you have to pay another $145,000 to get that moved out of the port. So small businesses that are abandoning their purchases, which means they're the sellers in China are never going to ship to them again. So that stuff's going to get picked up, bought at low value and sold in Mexico or Canada, where there's no tariffs on it. And the parts that small businesses, most of the parts that are imported aren't going to like a Stellantis plant. They're going to an 80-person factory in Kokomo or an 80-person factory, in Connersville, Indiana, and they're importing parts and they're assembling it. They're turning it into high value added. They're paying people $25 an hour to do that, and they're shipping that to Stellantis. And now they're saying, I can't do it. They're calling Stellantis, said, I can't deliver this because I can't make a profit on it. And Stellantis is saying, I'm sorry, we're not going to need it because we're not going to we're going to cut back on production this summer because we're not going to make a bunch of cars that are going to cost us $3,000 or $4,000 to sell, expecting the president to end his tariffs in 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 4 months.
Right. Are we actually going to see empty shelves?
Yeah, for some products we will. There'll certainly be, I expect them in shoes. I expect them in dolls. Things like that are consumer items right away that we would like to buy. There are going to be some empty shelves. Things that are very heavily sourced from China. People just, Walmart's not going to take a $40 shoe that is $40 right now. It's 145% of 40, $100+ for that shoe and mark it up that high, knowing full well that 3 weeks or a month from now, Donald Trump's going to end these tariffs, or at some point Congress is going to end tariffs. And one of the goals, if I'm a business like Walmart or Target, or I'm a Stellantis or GM or Honda, is that I don't want these tariffs. These tariffs are causing me to lay off workers. They're causing me to close warehouses and production facilities and retail shops. I don't want any part of this. So I'm not going to play the bait game with the president over this. And I think both Wall Street and Main Street understand these are a temporary thing. The only question is how painful it will be before he changes his mind. And my hunch is, we're talking on a Friday when the president has made overtures that he's going to drop the tariff rate from 145% to 80%, which is still an 800% increase from what it was January 1st, and an infinitely high increase from what it was in early 2018. So that the things that he's doing doesn't get us out of a recession. It makes the pain maybe less acute this summer. Maybe we won't have quite as many empty shelves, but we're going to have empty shelves. Mostly we're going to have higher prices, and mostly the biggest shock is going to be logistics, and manufacturing firms are going to really cut back. A 2 or 3% cut in auto sales, which is that's about where we're going to be anyway right now. That's a nationwide recession. It's a catastrophe in Indiana. Yeah. So if we go 2 months without making cars here because parts are delayed, because we're trying to source parts from somewhere else, or they're so expensive that we're just going to wait this out, which is a decision that a lot of firms are going to do, then that's really going to be disastrous. And my prediction is that even with announcement that things are getting easier, because that causes the stock market to come back up and people to feel better for a day or two till they realize, oh my gosh, 80% is a catastrophic tariff, that the uncertainty being built into this has prevented some of the damages from being felt, and it's prevented some of the benefits from accruing. So even if this was 150% tariff, there would be some companies that would start buying. If we knew it was permanent, if Congress passed a bill like Smoot-Hawley, some companies may say, oh, I'm going to come in, I'm going to automate my workforce tomorrow so that I can be cost competitive in 2 years. Let's just remember, when we onshore those factories, they're going to be dark factories. More importantly, if I needed to cut costs and I was faced with a big tariff on importing something from China, the easiest thing to cut costs on right now would be in your own domestic workforce. You could automate. Most factories could be automated if they knew their costs were going to rise 10%, which is well under what this tariff is going to be for most auto manufacturers. Immediately automate and cut 40% or 30% of their total costs in their workforce. So that's a really easy thing to do is we think, oh, it's got to be that we're going to onshore those tariffed items. No, nobody's going to onshore a tariffed item, spend a lot of money when if 2 years the tariff is gone. What they're going to do is spend money to automate their current operations domestically. So it's not a very thoughtful process to onshore American jobs. But even the benefit of that would be of a permanent tariff. It's not a net benefit, but the benefits would be we would start automating more production here, but nobody is going to make $1 billion capital expenditure based on the whims of a guy who is changing tax policy. I mean, he changed tax rates on Canada twice in one day and on China 3 times in a week. Nobody's making $1 billion capital expenditure decision in that environment. So I think we're going to see capital investment decisions absolutely plummet for quite some time here. And if they do go, they're going to be aimed at labor-saving capital investment in the United States. And that really hit the industrialized Midwest hard.
I think that's very important. Even if these tariffs work to the point where it brought more manufacturing back to America, a lot of that manufacturing is just going to be automated. It's not necessarily the jobs that they're. And I think if we're being honest, the reason that these jobs or the way that people think about manufacturing jobs are appealing is they think about maybe their grandparents or their parents that got a job at a factory and stayed there for decades without, a college degree. But something I find interesting is, I don't know if you saw this, but the survey basically 75% of America said we need more manufacturing jobs, but only 25% of them said I would work in them.
Right.
It's something like we romanticize it.
In fact, nothing like 25% of Americans would work at factory jobs. January of last year, there were close to 2 million manufacturing help wanted ads that were open.
Really?
Yeah. So there were plenty of opportunities to work in manufacturing if people wanted to go. What is going to happen with these tariffs? Let's say they stay in place. Let's say they're codified by Congress. I'm very confident that businesses are going to have to cut costs. And so where is the quickest and easiest and most certain way to cut costs? Well, it's not a 10% tariff on something from Mexico or Canada, or even 80 or 145% in China. Onshoring, that's very expensive, very capital intensive. And then you have to hire expensive American workers to work in that factory. What you'll do instead is you'll look at your entire supply chain and say, how can I squeeze my supply chain to reduce employment? And the answer is, I'm going to go to the American worker. American worker making $25 an hour in a factory job is great here in India. That's a great job because you're making another $10 an hour in healthcare bills and another couple dollars an hour on top of that in Medicare and FICA taxes. So you're making a ton of money, a bunch of benefits from that job. If I'm a manufacturer, do I onshore that $500 an hour or a week factory job from China that I can never find somebody to work at that wage because it's below minimum wage probably, and certainly I can't offer health benefits, or do I automate the existing American factory job? So if you raise costs in American manufacturing, the place that's easiest to cut costs in their supply chain is in their domestic manufacturing workforce. We're in the renaissance period of automation and digitization with artificial intelligence and machine learning and robotics. And so now you're giving the incentive for Americans to do that. And don't get me wrong, automation's a good thing. If it goes at the pace of the market, if it goes at a slow pace, if we're not accelerating it, that's fantastic. We call it economic growth. We want more machines doing drudge work. We don't want American workers, fathers, sons, daughters, husbands, and wives in a place that's dangerous. We want a robot to do that, but we want that to happen at the pace that the market dictates, not at the pace of the whims of a guy who couldn't really tell you what automation of a factory looked like. So that's the problem with it. So even if Donald Trump manages if we start bringing back more manufacturing production, it's going to come with fewer net workers over time.
Yeah. So even the benefits that it promises aren't very good comparatively to what's being promised, at least.
And so just to be clear, because I think this is important for listeners, I was in a Real Clear Politics or Politico ran a column with me and another economist from Indiana University Dr. Anderson, who said the same thing I did. We're already in recession right now. We just haven't started to feel it yet. I always point people back to like the fall of 2007. We were in recession. Nobody felt it until really the fall of 2008. The thing that you have to remember, if you're thinking about this right now, is that there are going to be pro-tariff folks. In this case, it was Jim Banks. They're going to find every anecdote of every business that says, "Oh, I just added 250 workers to my supply chain to do X," or "I'm expanding my operation to do that." There will definitely be some small-time winners. There are going to be some companies that say, "Oh, I can produce this on site. I've been buying it from Canada. I can do it on site. It'll cost me a little bit more, but I'll do it, and then I'll press release it, and I'll get a retweet from Jim Banks or Tucker Carlson or the president." What we're not going to hear about are all these press releases. They're not going to be talking about the press releases of companies that say, "Yeah, I'm closing up all my lines on May 12th because I'm run out of supply parts. I import 40% of what I have from China, 40% of my cost. This puts me out of business. I'm just going to idle them until these tariffs are gone because I know that every other factory in my region's going to be closing down this week or next week. I might as well cut my costs, lay my people off. Hopefully, I'll be opening back in a few weeks." And we're going to see a cascade of that. Everybody wants to be the last one to do that. I think of Elkhart, Indiana. That industry is in real trouble because of their import share of products that go onto their RVs and the really crashing demand for RVs that are going to come this summer. So they're going to be very reluctant, though, to lay off. That none of those companies who all hire from the same labor pool want to be the first ones to lay off somebody. But I tell you, the first one that says, "Hey, we're idling our RV factories for 3 weeks because we're oversupplied," the next day, everybody's going to do the same thing. It's going to be a cascade. And I think we're going to see cascading announcements of logistics companies laying off workers first, and then manufacturing companies laying off workers within days of that. And then you're going to start seeing retailers doing the same thing. And that's the end of May, June, and July. It's going to be a fevered pace of this cascade of bad news. And so don't let the anecdote that a Jim Banks, right, who says, "Oh, look, I got 250 more jobs in Fort Wayne," when Fort Wayne's going to lose, 8,000 jobs over the next quarter because of this recession. Don't let that fool you. Look at the official statistics.
Well, just as a matter of principle, I tend to not listen to anything Jim Banks says. We've talked a lot about tariffs, and I know we could go on a lot more, but I think what I want to do now is find out how narcissistic you are. You, of course, are a professor at Ball State. Have you ever taken the time to read Rate My Professor reviews of yourself?
Not for years.
Well, get ready because we're going to do some of them now. So
This is going to be interesting.
I will say overwhelmingly they're good, right? Like, for example, one of the first ones is that this could be a bad class, but Dr. Hicks made it interesting. My favorite one, though, is someone that got an A in your class said, "Hicks made me hate economics." When you hear that, does that make you feel like you did your job, though?
Nobody has hated economics any more than me. So, yeah, probably.
Oh, here's a good one. It was difficult, but he had a good sense of humor about it. One said you expect too much from your students, which I'm pretty sure every economics professor would probably get that review because it's not a easy topic. Here's my favorite one, though. Long-winded, monotonous, dull, and not a natural speaker. That said, he makes the material very clear and very easy to understand. It's a good class. I felt like that was one of the most backhanded compliments I've ever heard.
Yeah, that's the old Ben Stein cameo in Ferris Bueller's Day Off is Ben Stein talking about Smoot-Hawley tariffs, and he's just deadpan that non-natural speaker, and that's what I aspire to be. Yeah, that's a great compliment. I'd like to expect too much out of students. I want that on my tombstone. I want that. I want that at Arlington National Cemetery. I want that on my tombstone. Expected too much out of his students and soldiers over his career.
All right. Well, thank you for your time, Dr. Hicks. Thank you for teaching us about tariffs and for also giving us absolute panic attacks about what's about to happen.
Well, it's a panic is the right response, and as long as you turn that panic into picking up the telephone, dialing your local member of Congress and senators, and then call your local elected officials. I think it's very important. I don't do politics. I'm not a politics guy. I think it's very important to pin people's opinions down when they say they're for or against tariffs and they explain why. Yeah, I think it's important to know what that is and to know what are the effects, what are your arguments for these. And so you have them when the next election comes. And I would pin them down for it and share your concerns as well.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Hicks. Hopefully, the next time I talk to you, we're not talking about the Great Depression, number 2.
That's right. A better topic. It was good to be with you. I appreciate it greatly.
Thank you very much.